Grover Browning. I'm the program manager for automation here at the Global Research NOC. I'm going to present our plans for automation over the next 2 years, and specifically with a focus on the next year's plans. For those of you who were at GlobalNOC days, this is essentially the same presentation. There are a couple of additional notes, but not changed substantially. So the GRP-Automation program was established to help modernize the core functions that the GlobalNOC has in break-fix and configuration management. We had fallen behind a little bit and are now attempting to catch up and leverage existing technologies and put us, hopefully, leapfrogging us ahead into some new areas, particularly next year. We hope to deliver increases in efficiency, mean time to repair, security enhancements, and so on, all through the use of our automation program. We're thinking of automation in kind of 3 buckets. There are individual automation projects. So Tom Johnson, for example, might engage in an effort to automate syslog remediation or something like that. This is just something that he wants to do. And then there are network-wide projects. So this could be Internet 2 engaging in a project to work with cloud orchestration, for example. In both of these cases, the GRP automation group, which is what I represent, wouldn't be involved. We're not acting as a broker. We're not acting as a gatekeeper. We are in no way getting in the way of anyone engaging in any independent projects. Hopefully, the GRP automation program will put in place tools and techniques that the rest of the GlobalNOC can take advantage of. From that standpoint, you can see us as kind of taking a best practice from one group and making sure that the other groups also take advantage of it. And you'll be seeing that in our timeline, how we're leveraging that for the first few projects. And then there's AJ and Carlos. I see AJ on the call. AJ and Carlos kind of represent the back-end tooling and processes here. So in terms of individual projects, network projects, or the GRP automation projects, we're all kind of taking advantage of some of the tools that our systems group develops and puts in place and manages for us. It's really about how we use those tools to get those efficiencies and improvements. So the GRP automation program has a 2-year charge. First year, we are concentrating on configuration management. That essentially means the layer 2, layer 3 core packet forwarding devices. And that's, well, I guess self-explanatory, how you configure routers, how you configure switches. Year 2, we say more automation. That's in flux right now, but we fully anticipate that that's going to be a concentration on break-fix and auto-remediation, proactive monitoring, and areas like that, improvements in those areas. That means in year 1, what we're going to see is a lot of work with the network engineering groups and with our customers. And in year 2, you'll see us getting more involved with not only the network engineering groups, but the service desk and other groups that are involved in the entire process chain for break-fix. We have a goal for year 1, and that is to automate 80% of the changes on core layer 2-3 devices for those networks that we configure. Some networks, the GlobalNOC does not configure their devices for them. Essentially, we just do break-fix. But for those networks that we assist in configuring, either through provisioning or other work, we want about 80% of those changes to be automated. And that is something that we should be able to achieve in year 1. In looking at the sort of work we do to try to figure out what that 80% entails, what we discovered, and I should say we looked at the actual commands being typed on the routers and switches. So this actual scope up here for networks which we configure, it turns out that those are all based around Junipers. And Juniper has a feature called CLI accounting, which lets us see what people are typing. So we took a look at all of the set commands, which is how you make a change on a Juniper, and all of the commit commands, which is how you make those changes go live. Did some analysis on it, and discovered something very interesting. When we think about automation of configurations in particular, we often think about adding a new customer. So I'm adding a new interface or I'm adding a new BGP peer. It turns out that there is some of that, but a lot of what we do are changes to what I would call the kind of core configurations, one-time changes. So we might modify the loop back-in filter on every router, or we might modify a certain routing policy that every router has. And there tends to be a lot of that. In addition, we do a whole lot of interface work. So touching of interfaces is very common. The amount of actual provisioning we do in terms of, I want to set up a new BGP session for someone, actually not very substantial. If I look at a breakdown, the gray area, the large gray area here, represents interface work. It's a little misleading because some of this interface work is people logging into the router and setting an interface description to available. There's about 36,000 of those represented here. Someone ran a script. But there's also a lot of backbone interface work and a lot of customer interface work represented there. You can also see this orange section. Those are the policy options set of the config. And that's where typically you would add or change a prefix on a Juniper router. So we see a lot of kind of routine adding and deletions, changes to prefix lists that control what we accept from people's BGP sessions or ACLs for specific interfaces, for example. You can also see a large section of firewall commands. These are representative of policy changes. So I wish to change the policy for, let's say, the unicast RPF filter or the loop back-in filter, something along those lines. So I think you can see how you look at this. If we just pick up a couple of these areas, we'll easily be to our 80% goal. So the approach we're going to take over this next year is to kind of deploy an enabling technology or make a core kind of conceptual change in our minds that we're going to deploy out. And then the GRP automation team is going to go out and help each of our networks that are in scope with a use case, and they get to leverage us as free labor for as long as they wish. And then once we leave, once GRP automation leaves and moves on to the next project, then the networks are free to continue leveraging that deployment to get additional gains in those areas. And I'll go through a timeline and show you some examples of that. Our first project is something we're calling Set System. It started on Monday. What we're doing here is deploying GitHub and moving a portion of our configs into GitHub. GitHub then becomes the source of truth for all changes to the network for those portions of the config that are in GitHub. And as it might imply, Set System, we're initially moving the system stanza into GitHub. What you would see is essentially a text file there that has the system stanza for the routers, the core routers, and then the back end will automatically push that out to every router on the network that's in scope, ensuring that each one of those configs looks exactly like what's stored in GitHub. Now, there are some small changes we can make, so we can insert a host name for a specific device or a NTP server or NTP server. But essentially what we're talking about here are those parts of the config that hardly ever change, or those parts of the config that look the same on every router in the network. Look the same or nearly look the same for every router in the network. The other half, those things that look different, like customer interfaces or customer BGP sessions, we'll pick those up in a later project, but this first project is concentrating on this half of the config that is essentially the same on every box. So again, We'll enable GitHub for a network and then work with them to move their system stanza into it, as well as anything else they might like, and go through training and other processes to make sure that the engineers are able to take advantage of it just as easily as they are today. And I should mention that work, both Jason Ione and Molly Bayless have done a lot of work in that area already, and so we're going to leverage some of the work that they have already done. June 17th, we're going to start something that I call Global Prefix. This is based on some work that Tom Johnson has already done. Essentially, there are prefix lists on the routers that control things like SSHN or SNMPN, these sorts of interfaces and ACLs that deal with the whole box and protection of the box itself. Those global prefix lists we're going to define within the GlobalNOC database. So there's a section in there today called IP addresses, where we enter IP addresses that are in use and keep track of our IP addresses. Essentially, it's going to be in that area, or it's going to be similar to that area. You will put all of the prefixes you want in your SSHN list in there. And then, again, the back-end tools will grab that and automatically push it out to the network, ensuring that it is absolutely the same on every box in the network. I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in a security incident because somebody dropped a line in an ACL, and this will help with that. So the source of truth in this case is the database. We'll enter prefixes in the database, and that will get automatically pushed out to the network devices. Coming on the heels of that are per peer prefix lists. This is in late July. So this is essentially the same concept. Putting IP addresses into the database that represent prefixes, but this time we're pushing it out to the per BGP peer prefixes, those prefix lists that control which routes we accept from a peer. In addition, that same basic functionality can be leveraged on a per interface basis if we did want to provide or do a per interface, let's say ACL, if those were in place. But this uplift here is defining a prefix list in the database that is applied to essentially a BGP session through a peer or interface. Again, you can see how it kind of leverages the work that's gone before in terms of the global prefixes. So after these first three projects, things start to get a little iffy. I've only been on the job a short while, and while I've talked to a lot of people, there's still more to talk to. So after this, things get a little murkier, but we know about where we want to go based on how these first three projects go and conversations with both the staff and the customers. The future beyond here could be modified. But this is generally where we're going to go. Around September 9th, we're going to do a project called Campus. What this really means is enterprise. Some of our customers have large portions of their infrastructure that appear to be enterprises. So let's say closet switches or other WAPs, other sorts of enterprise environments. This particular project will focus on integration with other systems. So let's say DNS or DHCP, firewall systems that might be in place, WAP controllers, those sorts of things. Again, we don't know exactly what it is yet. We're still talking to folks, but we know it's going to be something that is of more value to those enterprise customers than it is to the rest of us. Up until this point, a lot of the work here has been concentrating on core routers. You'll know how I say core routers a lot or routers a lot. There are a lot of other devices that we have in our networks too, and the intent with this project is to try to capture a large portion of those. Going beyond that, around October 21st, we're going to start getting into interfaces. So these will be backbone interfaces, either single interface backbones or lags and lag groups, for example. This requires some changes to our database backend, and what we're hoping is that these first four projects gives our database team time to work on those changes in parallel So about the time October 21st runs around, we will have the changes we need in place and can proceed with our implementation plans. Again, this would be configuring a database through, or configuring an interface by editing the database, much in the same way global prefix or peer prefix did, and then those changes getting driven automatically out by the backend tool set. Following on the heels of that are interfaces for customers and peer networks, support interfaces like for the Sonar servers and so on. And then after that, the kind of science fiction view of automation, which is service provisioning. At that point, we will have support for BGP interfaces, some enterprise integration, prefix lists, and the one-time parts of the config. We can now put all of that together and have something akin to a web form where you enter information and then it goes out and configures the database, which then drives changes to the actual routers. So a kind of one-touch front page to doing some common tasks like I have a new customer or I need to turn up a new site, those sorts of things. And then around March 6th, a second kind of enterprise integration project. You'll notice it's titled Electric Boogaloo because the second of anything should be called Electric Boogaloo, based on the popular 1980s breakdance movie. At least one person laughing. Very good. And that's our timeline. Any questions from anyone? Any concerns? Anything I can clarify?
I have a few.
Sure.
When you talk about prefixes in your third step there, pure prefixes,
yeah.
Are you assuming that the source of record will be the GlobalNOC database for that?
So initially, I am assuming that it will be the GlobalNOC database. I think we are considering the role of the routing registries, in particular with the Google and AT&T announcements about some requirements there, about whether we could pull those directly from the routing registries rather than from our database. And I think it depends a little bit on which way, let's say, IRR support in our customer networks go. We don't want to force the customers to do a bunch of IRR work to get this advantage. But we also want to be cognizant that there's probably a whole lot of IRR updates coming here in the very near term. Okay. I would say that if it's not an initial delivery, it will follow on its, work through the IRR will follow on its heels.
Okay.
So at some point.
So that implies that there will be some database work to allow for the storage of those prefixes in the database and associated with a BGP peer or something.
Right.
Okay. So then this work, I guess the question that I have is, there's a lot of, I mean, some networks have very, very large prefix lists of, that go back 20 years, right? Pushing that into the database out of the router configs is going to be a fairly significant task, and we could probably automate some of that, but there's probably also some hand curation that needs to happen as well to make sure that things are associated with the right entities, for example, if that's a component to it. So where does that fit? Does that work start before, or can that work start before July 29th and allow for that pre-population to happen before you even start on the effort, or does it not even start? Is that not even available in the database until July 29th?
Let me answer the general question rather than the specific. So we recognize that the data model and getting the data into the database and keeping the data there that's accurate is probably our largest technical problem for this project. We believe that the culture change around these tools are probably the largest problem we have. But with regard to the technical issues, the largest technical issue is, as you point out, Chris, getting the data into the database, making sure that it's accurate, keeping it accurate. Towards that end, you'll see both Carlos and I working on this with the networks. So we don't intend to go to a network, let's say Internet 2, and say, hey, you need to put all your prefixes in the database. what you'll see is Carlos and I working with the Internet 2 engineers to understand the data model, and Carlos and I will begin to move those prefixes into the database ourselves using scripting where possible, and then hand curation where it's not possible. So we will be working full-time on that, I guess is my answer.
So you think you'll have resources to actually help with that ingestion? Absolutely.
This is not, let's say, an unfunded mandate to our customers' engineers or engineers. Carlos and I will be getting in and getting our hands dirty and sitting right there next to people doing the work.
Okay.
We'll need help understanding, right? But once we understand, yeah.
Yeah, and that's I guess that's my, one of my fears is that there's a lot of the configuration that for some of our networks have been around for a long time, and there might be questions about why things are there that you have to try and involve the person that put it there and do a little detective work. So I think it's going to be, I think we'll probably find that it's definitely more involved than that once we start digging in, but it's good to hear that there's some resources for helping with that. My last question is, as you start to create portions of the configuration that are being managed by these external tools with different sources of truth, some being, say, a Jinja template or something in whatever the automation tool is going to be called, some being configured from the database. How are we going, I mean, one of the challenges, and maybe this isn't your challenge, maybe this is for the network engineering groups to work out, we have to make sure that the engineers understand that during a transition period, this transition period where we're kind of in this hybrid, you're doing this portion of the config by hand, this portion of the config is handled by the database, this portion of the config is handled by some template somewhere in this tool. We have to figure out a way to make sure that everybody understands where the source of truth is so that they're not fragmenting things by just making the system worse by going to the wrong spot.
And I can give you a couple of examples about that we've thought about. So today the database represents essentially a scrape of the router configs, and so the database is populated by looking at the configs. As we go forward, it becomes a mixture of the database has been auto-populated and this data was manually put into the database, and now the database is populating the router. And we have to know which is which. In addition, as you point out, in this 9,000 line router config, how do we know which lines are automated and which lines are not? This is a substantial burden on the network engineer. We're going to take advantage of comments in both the templates, the Jinja templates, and in the router configs proper to try to ensure and help people understand which portions are automated versus, in which system. So ultimately, if you go to the router to configure, there should be a visual cues to help you understand both there and in the database. In addition, we'll cover this in training, and you'll be seeing us working with the senior engineering resources on each network. So maybe people like Matt and so on, Matt Mullins and so on, Jason Ione, to help them understand which portions of the config are which, to help them communicate that to their teams. So we're taking kind of a multi-pronged approach here to try to cover as many bases as possible to ease that burden.
Sure. Sounds good.
We're also going to be monitoring which parts of the config gets changed by who.
Okay, so there's some accountability too.
Yeah, and I mean, if we automate part of the config and somebody's still making configs that should be automated, then we can go in.
And we're doing that to help understand our training gaps and any use cases that we may have missed, as well as to help us understand how close we are to our 80% goal. So as Carlos points out, there will be a little bit on the back end to help us understand what's going on as well.
Cool.
And this gets kind of to that culture change thing that I was talking about, right, Chris? That being kind of the hardest part of it. So,
yep.
Other questions, concerns?
Is the automation part like a continuous process? For example, some part of the router configuration is managed in the database, right? Suppose someone goes into the router and makes some hand jam changes. Is it a continuous process where it continuously tries to push out, or?
So so Nikhil's question was, how do the changes actually get pushed out? Is it a continual process or what? So it's a good question. For those changes that are made in GitHub, this would be to kind of the static parts of the config, you'll go through kind of a general merge, pull and merge the way one normally would in GitHub. So you are manually triggering it. That also means that you can set up a change ahead of time, and then when your change window comes at midnight or 1 a.m., you can push the button and it will automatically execute. Nice. For those changes that are being pushed out from the database, today we have a kind of a web form demo. So you go to this web form and you say, okay, I made a change, click the button, and it will drive the change out to the routers. That's how we're doing it today. That may not be how we do it in the future, but it is likely to have both a manual portion to it, at least in the beginning, as well as a diff to show what changes will be made to the router if the engineer goes forward to help them understand the scope and the impact of what they're about to do.
So the changes from the database, will that be scoped? So if you say, hey, I've made changes in the database, I'm ready for them to be pushed out, is it for sure only going to be the changes you made?
We think so. Oh, so let me rephrase that. Yes, it will be. And we are working with the database team to start thinking about transactional models of the database. So the changes that Molly made to this interface are the ones I want to push out, or the changes that Brian made to this prefix list are the ones I want to push out. So a more kind of transactional view of the database changes, or something like that. I don't want to be too prescriptive, but something that helps folks understand, I want to roll out just this change in the database, not all these other changes, including this partial one that somebody started to enter but didn't finish, right? Because that's the danger.
Yeah, I would imagine, not in the short term, but in the long term, what this does is just puts network changes, gives network changes all of the same good and bad sides of all of the other continuous integration, continuous deployment kinds of things that people in this world have been dealing with for years, right? So
yeah,
all
and we've
of
got some,
how, how do you test, how do you roll it out, and how do you, what are all the different opportunities there?
and we think we know what the long-term answers are, and we think we have some short-term workarounds so that we don't get into these like race condition sorts of issues.
Yeah,
the whole goal here is to help make it easier, not harder. So,
yeah,
I'm sorry I interrupted.
Just to say, like for now, yes, if somebody's halfway done with the change and you click the push this out, their halfway completed change is going to go. Eventually, we want to get to the point where that doesn't happen, but we're not there right now. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware that to start with, that is not going to be the case.
And we should note that AJ's opinion does not necessarily represent mine.
I mean, technically, there's no way to do it. Like, I mean, if I start making changes in GRNOC DB and Matt Mullins makes some other change and pushes it, my change is included. There's no way to not do that right now.
So these are all the CI/CD challenges.
That's right, and there are solutions to these. We'll be working on those.
And even like the view of what you see in the database, what is the actual truth of what's out there or what's proposed? You need to kind of know both.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
Grover, how are you guys going to account for like things that happen during troubleshooting or like on the fly changes that are inevitable when people are on the command line?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's coming, I think, mostly in the interface and BGP kind of sections of it. And I don't think we have those fully thought through yet. We have a couple of use cases that we're kicking around to try to figure out, do you blow it away? Do you do a, well, how do I want to say this? Do you do a pull back in to the auto-populate portion? So we're trying to kick around some use cases, but we don't necessarily know the answer to that yet. We know that we have to somehow capture that and account for it. Ultimately, you have to have somebody on a command line during these, let's say, incident, the network gets down incidents. We're still trying to figure that out.
So one thing that occurs to me here is that we might have a silent issue that we don't fully understand in terms of what people are doing in the database today that might get in the way of some of these things. So you're talking about like multiple people making changes in the database and all that. It just reminded me, I mean, I don't know today, for example, how much the service desk or, frankly, even Internet 2 staff who have write access are actually making changes to the database. I think the answer is not very much, right? But sure. I don't know that for sure because there aren't a lot of impactful things that happen when somebody does something wrong. You tend to find it years after the fact. So the question I guess we might have here is, do we need to tighten up our access and processes around who can make changes once we start kind of creating portions of the configuration that are driven off of that? Do we need to have a better way of accounting for who's making those changes?
Or even just a visibility. If I change this, it will change something on the network.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big problem is going to be, I think, people understanding. I mean, we have this with reporting today, right? If somebody makes a change to something, they don't necessarily understand the issue because that might cascade into 3 different things that end up in a report somewhere. But we're almost talking about the same thing in terms of this. Like it might be, you make a change here and it cascades into a configuration change.
Yeah, and so I think we've recognized that as an issue, and we have a couple of, let's say, general ideas around it. The first is leveraging our existing role codes for users, right? So we have role-based authentication and read-write systems already on the routers, and you can easily see how that could extend to the database. When you're hitting, let's say, an interface to configure that will be pushed out live, permissions for that are essentially the same as network permissions for editing the core config, which we already have experience with. The second is letting folks know if I edit this, the change will get pushed out sorts of information. So changes, you can imagine, let's say, a different shading on the box or something to help folks understand that if it's shaded in red, for example, then if I change this, it will be pushed out. In addition, we're concentrating on diffs and the manual approval of diffs. So before a change is pushed out live, a diff is done to show the engineer what changes will be made to the router based on what they just did. And then they will be able to approve that or not in order to push that change out. So it's not just I made a change in the database and it automatically got pushed out. There's a whole chain here that includes somebody looking at the diffs to say, yep, that's what I want to do, that's what I intend, before they go live.
So it's a much more intentional workflow than I'm thinking. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. When sometimes I call, something called science fiction automation, right? Which is this whole, I made the change in the database and it magically happened. Or I magically turned up a BGP session by entering something into a form. And I think that's all kind of an end state that we'd love to get to, but there's a whole lot we need to do to get there first, and there's a whole lot of advantage we can get on the timeline before we get there.
Yep.
You guys thought about what's the reward process is going to be like? Suppose I make some 100 changes, right? And something bad happens. I want to, just revert it back in a single click.
So Nikhil's asking about change reversions, right? And we have a couple of options there. We have both the option on the Junipers, right? Which are going to roll back the config, but we also have the abilities through GitHub to revert changes back, right? So we're planning on leveraging those changes. And so you can think about it in 3 ways. You can also say, I'm just going to go back and re-edit the template. So instead of rolling back, I'm manually correcting whatever the issue was.
the rollback seems like a good idea in case your change is so catastrophic that, you lose access.
Yeah, that's right. And, I'll say something else related to that. Blast radius is a really big deal in networking, right? Especially in backbone networks. I can't just go to the LA router and plug my console into it. I'm in Indiana. So the concept of blast radius is a real big deal. And sometimes, the joke is that now we can blow up the network 100 times faster than we used to be able to. So we're looking at, as we roll through these changes, and in particular this first batch with set system, we're looking at helping people understand and document how they release changes to the network. So if you were to change your core loop back in, would you do that on every box right at the same time? Or would you deploy it to one box first, let it burn in for a day, and then deploy it to the East Coast or 3 or 4 more routers? So helping folks document their release process so that we can then capture that in the automation as well, so that by the time we get to pushing the button to make things happen on the other 80% of the network, essentially the change has already been tested on the first traditional change nodes.
One of the other things that we're looking at too is doing, it's slightly difficult, but being able to do some amount of essentially unit testing of your configs, pushing them out to, say, a VMX setup in our test lab or the physical devices in the test lab, and validating some core aspects of your config, such as the BGP templates look good, your system stanza all works, like being able to do some amount of validation before actually pushing changes out is one of the things that we are looking at.
Let me talk about that just a little more because it's super cool. It's super cool. So imagine Brian was getting ready to deploy a change on the network. And before he did that, we went out and automatically spun up a whole bunch of VMX nodes and applied config to them so they looked exactly like the Internet 2 network as it was running today, including receiving routes from external peers, because we already know what routes we receive from those peers. And then we take a snapshot of the state, apply the change, take another snapshot of the change, and tell Brian, hey, I made that change you wanted, and this is what it looked like in terms of BGP sessions. Looks like now we're getting 0 BGP routes from every peer on the network. Is that what you intended, Brian? And then Brian can say, yeah, that's what I intended. And it will then automatically tear down the test lab and go out and deploy the change. So this sort of spinning up an exact copy, or as close as we can get to it, applying a change, looking at the results and diffing the states, tearing it down, and then going on. This sort of unit testing, I think, is very exciting and something that we're very interested in. I don't know that it's coming soon, but it's absolutely something that we're looking at.
We talked about this a little bit at GlobalNOC days, Grover, but like just hearing about this, I'm excited about like the future of automation and the capabilities, but I just feel like there's going to be an enormous, at least for EnWave, there's going to be an enormous amount of like manual data entry, like to get to the magical world of automation, which I'm just kind of dreading. And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know how to solve that on this network, but it's just worth expressing to you guys, just again, like how hard it's going to be for us.
Yeah, so we know that there's an issue with that. And I think all of our networks probably have that issue, and the ones that are enterprise focused probably have it even more. And I think that's probably both NOAA and our campus users. So we're hoping that Carlos and his scripting will be able to help us with some of that. My role is kind of one of the senior engineers. I've got the technical expertise to understand a lot of what's going on under the hood. And we also know that data validation is kind of a big part of this, both defining the data model up front and ensuring that the data remains consistent. So we're thinking about those issues, and we will have free labor. I don't promise that we have all of the answers, but we know that we have some tools to apply to it at this point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
I was going to say, I don't think it mitigates it entirely, but if you think about our work today, it already includes quite a bit of manual entry. It's just manually entering on a CLI, right? So hopefully that part gets less manual.
Anything else? Well, I'm here, and if I don't reach out to you, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be sending out a recording of this session, as well as the slides and kind of a write-up of what I said to the users group and to GlobalNOC all. And we are spinning up a website where we're going to put this data as well, so it'll be available for you to distribute to whoever. They can see what we're doing. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Yep. Thanks, see ya.